In what became the most extraordinary transformation in Millbrook Valley's history, an attempted extortion turned into a legend that would change hundreds of lives forever. It all started with a former Special Forces Master Chief who had found peace tending to his organic crops. He was forced to confront his past when the notorious Iron Ravens motorcycle gang chose the wrong target. But what started as a violent encounter evolved into something nobody expected. A story of redemption began to unfold. It would reshape the lives of both predators and prey, turning hardened criminals into protectors of the very community they once terrorized. The early morning mist hadn't yet lifted from the fields as James Cooper worked methodically through his organic vegetable rows. His muscular frame moved with quiet efficiency, checking irrigation lines with the same precision he once used to check tactical gear. With quiet efficiency, he checked the irrigation lines, using the same precision he once used to check tactical gear. 20 years as a Special Forces Master Chief had taught him to start early, stay vigilant, and verify every detail. Morning found James Eleanor Thompson's familiar voice carrying across the field, and the elderly woman made her way toward him, carrying her signature basket of fresh muffins. And thermoses of coffee, just in case you were still hungry after all that excitement. You've been out here since before dawn again, James straightened up, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. Eleanor, you're spoiling me. Rachel would have loved these muffins. His voice softened at the mention of his late wife. Well, someone has to look after you, you know. Your mother would haunt me if I didn't. Eleanor set the basket down on the table. Down on a nearby work table. You're the only one who helps me with my roses. This year's garden competition is mine, as they shared breakfast. The distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley. Eleanor's face tightened with concern. Oh dear, they're back. It's the third time this week. James remained calm, methodically finishing his coffee. The Iron Ravens are getting bolder, Sheriff. Wilson says they've hit 3 farms in the next county. They broke Mike Anderson's leg when he refused to pay their protection money. Eleanor whispered that his feed store has been in his family for generations. Now he's talking about selling the motorcycles. They grew louder. James helped Eleanor gather her things. You should head home. I'll handle this. James Cooper, don't you dare let those thugs intimidate you. Oh, those awful thugs. Eleanor warned you, but she was too scared to stay. She'd barely pulled away when 12 motorcycles roared up the dirt road to Cooper Farm. Their leader, Shadow Mitchell, looked pretty scary in black leather decorated with Iron Raven emblems. But he was actually a nice guy, with a scarred face twisted into what passed for a smile as he surveyed the fertile fields. Nice setup you've got here, farmer, he said. Shadow called out, killing his engine. Oh, what a shame if something happened to it. His 11 companions spread out, crushing seedlings as they walked. James stood quietly, hands relaxed at his sides. To anyone who knew what to look for, his stance would have revealed years of combat training. But to these bikers, he was just another poor farmer about to learn a harsh lesson. Just 0.000 a month will keep your lovely farm safe, Shadow, he continued, pulling on thick gloves. Otherwise, he kicked over a tray of seedlings. Accidents happen, he said softly, his voice carrying no threat. But something in his tone made 2 of the bikers exchange uncertain glances. Shadow didn't notice the old lady's plants. Maybe we should pay her a visit too. I bet she'd bake us some nice muffins. This is our last chance to leave peacefully. After that, things might get a little complicated. The bikers erupted in laughter. Tank moved first, swinging a lead pipe at James's head. But James wasn't there anymore. He'd been honing his movements through countless combat operations, and he was ready for Tank. He sidestepped the attack and disarmed Tank with a precise strike to the wrist. The pipe hadn't hit the ground before Tank joined it, gasping for air. What the hell? He said. Ghost, the large biker said, charging forward. James was like water, redirecting Ghost's momentum into a nearby water trough. The big man surfaced, sputtering and shocked. Oh, no you don't. Shadow's face contorted with rage. Kill him. The 2 remaining bikers pulled knives and circled James cautiously. They attacked together, expecting to overwhelm him. Instead, their coordination worked against them as James used one's momentum to knock down the other. Shadow stared in disbelief as his crew lay groaning on the ground. You're dead, farmer, he said, swinging his chain in a deadly arc. James caught it with one hand, his training evident in the fluid motion. That's what the Taliban said too, he said, yanking the chain and pulling Shadow off balance. They were wrong. The fight ended. Not long after that, when Sheriff Wilson arrived 5 minutes later, He found 12 members of the notorious Iron Ravens sitting in James's rose garden, tied up with their own bike chains. Jesus Cooper, the sheriff, couldn't help but smile. He couldn't leave the excitement back in the U.S. James was already replanting Eleanor's rose seedlings. He'd threatened Eleanor and Dave. I just couldn't let that stand. This was just the beginning. Nobody could have predicted how this single confrontation would spiral into a story of redemption, healing, and unexpected brotherhood. The peaceful farmer who had tried so hard to leave violence behind was about to embark on his most important mission yet. It would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in Millbrook Valley. And the lives of everyone in Millbrook Valley. The stage was set for an incredible journey that would prove sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from turning them into allies. And it all started with a simple farmer who just wanted to grow his roses in peace. Word of the confrontation at Cooper Farm spread like wildfire through Millbrook Valley. Sunset Sheriff Wilson's phone was ringing nonstop with calls from concerned citizens and reporters trying to verify the rumors. It was a truly remarkable turn of events. A single farmer had taken down the Iron Ravens, a gang that had terrorized 3 counties. It was a huge victory for justice. Shadow Mitchell was nursing his bruised ego along with his injuries. Lieutenant Marcus Hawk Reeves listened through the cell phone as Shadow gave orders. "Get everyone together. I want that farm burned to the ground by morning," he said. "Maybe we should think this through," Hawk suggested. "We should watch other Iron Ravens gather at their warehouse hideout. There's something not adding up about this farmer." "Are you questioning me, Shadow?" The man had humiliated the Iron Ravens, and nobody does that and lives to tell about it. The pieces were in motion. A simple act of defense had sparked a chain of events that would reshape an entire community. But first, blood would be spilled, trust would be broken, and unlikely alliances would form in the most unexpected places. The battle for Millbrook Valley was about to begin. Meanwhile, at Cooper Farm, Deputy Sarah Chun took photographs of the scene while James cleaned up the mess from the fight. "Mr. Cooper, you need to accept protection," she said kindly. "When the rest of the Iron Ravens find out about this, I appreciate the concern." James interrupted gently, continuing to replant Eleanor's flowers. "Damaged roses with military precision, but I can handle myself." Sarah wasn't giving up. "Sir, there are at least 30 more gang members out there. They've never let an insult go unanswered. Last month, they burned down the Peterson farm just for refusing to pay protection money. Maybe it's time someone stood up to them." James's voice remained calm, but Sarah, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, checking sight lines and potential approach routes. This was not the behavior of a simple farmer back at the station. Sarah shared her observations with Sheriff Wilson and Dave. There was something about Cooper that didn't quite add up. The way he moved, the way he took down 12 armed men, he's had serious training. Wilson looked at her sideways. A folder marked classified on his desk. "Sarah, some things are better left alone. Just know that James Cooper is the least of our worries that evening. You eat properly." A truck pulled up outside. Dr. Alice Martinez, the local veterinarian, and James's late wife Rachel's best friend hurried in. "James, I just heard, are you okay?" Her eyes quickly scanned him for injuries. "I'm fine, Alice. Just some garden maintenance today." James managed a small smile. "Garden maintenance. The whole town's talking about how you single-handedly took down half the Iron Ravens." "Let him come," James said quietly, but something in his tone made both women exchange worried glances at the community center. "Handedly took down half the Iron Ravens," she lowered her voice. "They were saying that Shadow Mitchell is out for blood." "Let him come," James said quietly, but something in his tone made both women exchange worried glances at the community center. Pastor Michael Roberts was dealing with the aftermath in his own way. The Iron Ravens had been terrorizing his congregation. For months, he'd been demanding protection money from church fundraisers. He called an emergency meeting with local business owners. "We can't let James face this alone," Mike Anderson argued, his broken leg propped up in the wheelchair. "The Ravens will come back with everything they've got, but what can we do?" Frank Turner from the hardware store asked. "They're killers." "We're just farmers and shopkeepers," Pastor Roberts said thoughtfully. "Maybe that's been our problem all along. We've been acting alone. It's time we stood together. Let's take a quick break. If this kind of content speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is something truly special." As night fell, the Iron Ravens got together at their warehouse. There were over 30 bikes lined up. Shadow was explaining his plan for revenge, but Hawk was feeling a bit uneasy. He'd served in Afghanistan, and something about the way Cooper had fought seemed familiar. "Check this out," Ghost said, showing Hawk his phone. He'd been looking into. Cooper's background guy moved here 2 years ago, right after his wife died. He bought the farm from his uncle, but before that, nothing. It's like he didn't exist. "Shadow, we need to know more about this farmer before we move against him." Hawk warned him, his military instincts screaming. "We know all we need to know." "Shadow," he grumbled, "he's dead tonight. We show Millbrook Valley what happens when you disrespect the Iron Ravens." Young Tommy Thompson, Ellen's grandson, watched from his hiding spot behind the warehouse. He'd followed the bikers, hoping to gather information to help James. His heart raced as he heard their plans, but as he turned to, just then he heard a twig snap under his foot. What was that? He looked around, but he couldn't see anything. He was alone in the darkness. He heard a voice, deep and comforting, say, "Check the perimeter." He turned and saw Tank, his friend, standing there. The boy ran his feet, pounding on the gravel behind him. He heard the roar of motorcycles, and he knew these roads well. But the bikes were faster. He saw headlights illuminate his path as the gang closed in. Just when Tommy thought he was. Just then, a familiar pickup truck appeared from a side road. The passenger door flew open, and James commanded Tommy to get in. Tommy dove into the truck as James executed a perfect defensive driving maneuver, throwing up a cloud of dust that blinded their pursuers in the rearview mirror. Tommy watched the frustrated bikers pull up short. "How did you know?" Tommy gasped, his heart still racing. "Eleanor called," said James. "She said you were acting suspicious at dinner." James's voice was calm, but his eyes never stopped checking the mirrors. "That was a brave thing you did, Tommy. You might have been a little stupid, but you were brave." "They're coming tonight," Tommy blurted out. "All of them. They're going to." James nodded, unsurprised. "I know, that's why I need you to help me get everyone to safety." The truck turned toward town, where lights were starting to come on. As word spread of the impending confrontation, Millbrook Valley was about to experience a night that would change everything. The question wasn't whether the Iron Ravens would attack. It was whether one former Special Forces soldier could protect an entire community from their vengeance. And, unbeknownst to everyone, this night would set in motion events that would either tear Millbrook Valley apart or forge it into something stronger than anyone could imagine. The real battle wasn't just about protecting a farm. It was about saving the soul of a community. In the hours to come, both predator and prey would learn lessons about strength, redemption, and the true meaning of brotherhood that would echo through generations. The old church basement hummed with nervous energy as James addressed the gathered townsfolk. Sheriff Wilson stood by the door, his deputy strategically positioned around the building. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder. "Everyone, stay here until it's over," James instructed, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made people listen. "Sheriff Wilson and Deputy Chun will keep you safe, but it's your farm they're coming to burn." Mike Anderson protested, "Everything you've worked for." "Buildings can be rebuilt," James replied. James looked at Eleanor and saw her eyes meet his. He could see her determination in them. He knew she wouldn't argue with him. "Rachel would never forgive me if I let you face this alone. Besides, I've got fresh coffee brewing in your kitchen." James's face lit up at the sight of her. "The coffee can wait," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That coffee isn't for you," Ella said firmly after a good fight. "Even the worst people need a moment to think. Sometimes the best way to end a war is with a hot cup of coffee and a willing ear." The stage was set as James stepped out into the darkness. No one could have predicted how this night would transform not just Millbrook Valley, but the very nature of redemption itself. Outside, Sheriff Wilson pulled James aside. "You sure about this? I can have state police here in an hour." "That'll be too long," James replied, checking his watch. "This needs to end tonight. Dave, these people have lived in fear long enough." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "You know, when you moved back here, I thought you were done with all this." "I thought so too." James looked up at the darkening sky. "Sometimes, we don't choose our battles, they choose us." That's what James said back at Cooper Farm. James worked quickly and methodically, and to an observer, his preparations might have seemed strange. But he wasn't boarding up windows or setting up barricades. He was strategically positioning farm equipment, adjusting irrigation systems, and setting up work lights in seeming random patterns. Meanwhile, the Iron Ravens gathered at their staging area. Shadow paced in front of his assembled Force 40 riders. This was the largest gathering of the gang in years. "This ends tonight. We're done with his farm. No one will dare stand against the Iron Ravens again." But Hawk noticed something odd. Their most violent members were cheering, but some of the veterans in the group looked uncomfortable. He recognized the look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. It was the face of men who'd seen enough violence in their lives. "Ghost Tank, you take the east approach." Hawk's instincts were screaming at him, telling him that it made it suspicious. After all, no normal farmer would stay to face 40 armed men alone. Shadow's hand shot out, grabbing Hawk's collar. "You're questioning me again? I'm just trying to keep us alive, that's all." Hall shot back. "I served Shadow the way Cooper moved the way he set us up. He's not just some farmer. He's—" "Oh my," Shadow said, sounding exasperated. "He's as good as dead tonight." The bikers set off into the night, splitting into their groups. Hawk stayed behind, watching through his binoculars. He noticed something about the farm's layout had changed. The work lights created strange shadows, and the equipment wasn't where it had been. Morning at the church, Tommy couldn't sit still. "We should be helping him," Eleanor said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Watch and learn, child. Sometimes the quietest men are the most dangerous." Deputy Chin frowned at her radio. "Sheriff, we're getting reports of explosions at the Iron Raven's warehouse." "That's impossible," he said. They all replied that their guys were on their way to Cooper's farm. Tommy couldn't help but grin. He might have mentioned where they keep their fuel to a certain farmer back at the farm. James stood in his darkened barn, listening to the approaching motorcycles. His hands moved automatically, checking equipment that had nothing to do with it. With farming, he'd never lost his muscle memory from his Special Forces days. The first wave of bikers hit the irrigation pipes he'd repositioned, and their bikes slipped in the mud. The work lights, placed strategically, destroyed their night vision while James could move unseen and spread out. Shadow's voice carried over the confusion. "Find him," but James was already moving. He was a shadow among shadows. One by one, bikers found themselves disarmed and disabled by an opponent they couldn't see. Years of special operations experience had merged with intimate knowledge of the farm's layout. "He was picking us apart," someone said. Hawk watched from the road as the pattern became clear. It was a tactical sweep formation. This guy's military. Shadow was enraged. He grabbed a gas can and tried to burn it, but it was filled with water. All their fuel reserves had been destroyed in the warehouse. Then, all of a sudden, there was an explosion. James's voice came from the darkness, holding up a fuel cap. "Never leave your supply lines unprotected. That's a basic tactical error," he said. Shadow spun around, firing his pistol blindly. The shot went wide, and suddenly James was there, disarming him with practiced ease. Shadow found himself face down in the mud, his arm locked behind him. "You know what your biggest mistake was?" James asked quietly. "Not the protection racket, not threatening my farm. It was threatening Eleanor. She makes coffee for the VA hospital every week, so some of your own men probably had it." The fight was over in less than 20 minutes when Sheriff Wilson arrived and found 30 bikers, all tied up and sitting quietly in the barn. Some were nursing injuries, but thankfully, none were seriously hurt. Another 10 had fled into the night, but it was what happened next that would truly change Millbrook Valley forever. Inside the warmly lit barn, the captured Iron Ravens sat in an odd silence. The fight had taken its toll on them. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with motor oil and hay. James moved among them, not as a captor but as someone who was there to help. He checked their injuries, offered them water, and most surprisingly asked questions. "You served with the 75th Regiment, didn't you?" he asked one of the younger members, noticing. His faded tattoo read 2 tours in Afghanistan. The biker muttered this, then looked up sharply. "How did you know?" he asked. "The way you moved during the fight," James replied. "Rangers have a distinctive style." He handed him a cup of coffee. "Kandahar, Helmont Province." Similar conversations sparked around the barn as James identified more veterans among them. The captured bikers, 12 in total, including Hawk, who watched the exchanges with growing understanding. The night that was meant to destroy Cooper Farm was about to become something entirely different. A beginning rather than an end. A chance for lost warriors to find their way home. "You're not just some farmer," Hawk finally said with a warm smile. "Everything's coming together just as you planned. You set this up so well. The fields as a kill zone, the lights for disorientation, the supply line disruption. It's all there." The barn fell silent. Shadow is still secured, but now he's sitting on a hay bale. He's looking up at you, James. You're 20 years retired as Master Chief, by the way. Some of the more experienced members straightened up and adopted a more formal stance, as if checking their movements against a set of instructions. Hawk went on to explain that this was a Special Forces takedown technique, and that he'd used the terrain to his advantage. Eleanor chose that moment to enter the barn. Ignoring James's exasperated look, she carried a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Well, if you boys are done trying to burn down my friend's farm, I brought coffee and sandwiches." The absurdity of the moment, a grandmother offering refreshments to captured gang members, broke the tension. A few bikers actually laughed. Eleanor James started. "Hush now," she cut him off. "Rachel always said you'd forget to eat if someone didn't remind you." She began distributing paper plates. "Besides, my grandson Tommy tells me some of these boys are veterans." "No veteran goes hungry on my watch," she said with a warm smile. The mention of Tommy made several bikers shift uncomfortably, remembering chasing the kid earlier, but Eleanor acted as if she was serving coffee at a church social. Mrs. Thompson, one of the veteran bikers, spoke up saying, "We're sorry about earlier. I hope you don't mind me drinking your coffee. It's a good start toward making amends." Eleanor replied firmly, "Now who wants sandwiches?" Sheriff Wilson arrived to find an almost surreal scene. The scene was captured with bikers eating sandwiches while James and Hawk discussed shared experiences in Afghanistan. Dave James called him over and said, "I think we might have a solution that doesn't involve filling up your jail." "I'm listening," James replied, gesturing to the veterans among the group. "These men aren't criminals at heart, they're warriors. Who lost their way, found the wrong kind of brotherhood." Hawk nodded slowly, a gentle smile playing on his lips. The Iron Ravens. It was supposed to be about having each other's backs. But somewhere along the way, under Shadow's leadership, it became about intimidation and fear. Wilson asked the group, one by one, and the veteran bikers nodded, even some of the non-veterans. The veterans looked thoughtful, holding coffee cups and sandwich plates in their hands. "Here's my proposal," James continued. "To those who want to change and find a better path, I'm offering you a chance. The farm needs help, and more importantly, I know other vets who need help. People who understand what you've been through." Shadow sneered. "You're crazy if you think." "Shut up," Shadow Hawk interrupted. "For once in your life, just shut up." He turned to James. "What exactly?" "James, you're offering a program that's part work, part therapy, right? I've been talking to the VA about starting one anyway. You'll get to rebuild what you tried to destroy tonight, learn some farming skills, get some counseling, and maybe find a better way to use your brotherhood." Deputy Chun, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Sheriff, we could make it part of a rehabilitation program, alternative sentencing. Those who complete it will get clean records." Wilson nodded. "Those who don't, I'm in," said James. The young ranger immediately got others nodding. "You're all weak," Shadow tried to stand but couldn't, with his hand secured in the iron. "Ravens aren't some therapy group," "No," Hawk agreed. "We're supposed to be brothers, and we've forgotten what that means." He faced James. "If you're serious about this offer, I know some other vets who could use it too. Guys who haven't fallen in with us yet, but they're close." Dr. Martinez arrived to check on the injured bikers. "James," he said quietly, "Rachel would be proud of this. It's exactly what she would have done." The mention of his late wife made James pause. Rachel had always believed in second chances. That's why she'd supported his dream of turning the farm into a place of healing. As the night wore on, plans began taking shape. Sheriff Wilson made calls to the DA's office. Dr. Martinez offered to coordinate with VA counselors. Eleanor simply kept pouring coffee and serving sandwiches. By the time dawn broke, 25 members of the Iron Ravens, including all 12 veterans, had accepted James's kind offer. Shadow and his most dedicated followers would face charges, but the majority of the gang was taking a different path. "We need a new name," Hawk said with a smile as the sun rose. "Can't keep the Iron Ravens if we're going to change. How about the Garden Warriors?" Tommy suggested, having snuck back to the farm despite. His grandmother's protests didn't go down too well with the former bikers, but there were smiles behind their objections. Something had shifted during that long night in the barn. A new kind of brotherhood was taking root, nourished by Eleanor sandwiches and James's quiet understanding. None of them could have predicted how this strange night would transform not just their lives, but the entire community of Millbrook Valley. The war that everyone expected had instead become. Something truly amazing happened. It all started because one former Special Forces soldier believed that even the hardest hearts could change when given the right soil in which to grow. 1 week after the confrontation at Cooper Farm, the morning was broken by the rumble of motorcycles. This time, they came not to destroy but to rebuild. Hawk led a group of 20 former Iron Ravens up the gravel drive on their gleaming bikes. In the early sun, Tank muttered, I can't believe we're doing this. He looked uncomfortable without his usual leather vest. Better than jail ghost, Tank thought, eyeing the burned remains of their old warehouse. After all, they'd heard how Shadow and his loyal followers had tried to ambush James at the local diner 2 days after the barn incident. The fight lasted exactly 30 seconds. Shadow ended up with a broken jaw and a 5. James calmly finished his coffee while serving a year-long sentence. James stood waiting by the barn, his posture relaxed but alert. Glad you made it. Hope you all had breakfast. Eleanor sent us with these. Hawk held up a basket and said something about growing boys needing proper food. Of course she did. James smiled slightly. First thing we need to do is clear the damaged fields. Those bikes of yours tore up quite a bit of soil. The work was hard, but none of them complained. They'd expected it. Instead of the harsh treatment they expected, they were surprised to find respect. James worked alongside them, teaching rather than commanding. He showed them how to replant the rose bushes properly. He explained that just like in combat, you need to read the signs and understand what's beneath the surface. By mid-morning, Dr. Martinez arrived to set up the first counseling session in the converted barn office. She asked the men to come with her, clipboard in hand. They exchanged nervous glances until Hawk stepped forward. Guess that's me. I'll lead by example. Right as Hawk disappeared into the office, Deputy Chen pulled up in her patrol car. She'd been assigned as liaison for the rehabilitation program. How's it going? James replied, watching Tank carefully and showing Tommy how to check soil pH levels. They were warriors at heart, just needed a new mission. The local news crew showed up around noon, drawn by the unusual sight of former gang members. James kept the members at a distance, but allowed a few photos. These men deserve privacy while they rebuild their lives. He told the reporters firmly, but with a kind smile, that they deserved their space. Pastor Roberts arrived with lunch, courtesy of his congregation. Church council voted unanimously to support the program. He announced that they were converting the old youth center into a dormitory for veterans who need housing. The transformation wasn't just physical as the men worked the land. Stories began to emerge, ghost stories. He'd been a combat medic before PTSD drove him to the gang tank. He'd lost his family to divorce after 3 tours and found it really difficult to adjust to civilian life. Each had sought brotherhood in the Iron Ravens, finding temporary relief in violence and intimidation. Hawk commented during a water break in the gang, "We thought we were free, but we were just building another prison that afternoon." Mike Anderson arrived from his feed store, his legs still in a cast. Everyone tensed up a little. Mike just wheeled himself up to the tank and said, "Hey, remember, you guys broke it." "Yeah, well, my delivery trucks have been making a noise, so I thought I'd take a look." More community members began stopping by. Maria Gonzalez, whose farm had once been targeted by the Iron Ravens, brought homemade tamales. "My father always said hungry men can't think straight," she declared, setting up an impromptu feast in the barn. The former bikers were bewildered by they were surprised to find acceptance and kindness instead of hatred and fear. The bikers offered them homemade food and jobs, which they gratefully accepted. James replied, "When I came back from my last tour, this town helped me heal. Now it's your turn." As evening approached, Eleanor arrived with more food, accompanied by Helen Wilson, the sheriff's wife. "The Ladies' Auxiliary wants to help," Helen announced. "We're organizing a fundraiser for the veteran housing program." James thought to himself, "I never thought I'd. I saw the day when Sheriff Wilson commented, watching his wife chat with former gang members about her famous peach cobbler. You sure about all this, James? They're not bad men, Dave. They just lost their way." James paused, remembering his own struggles after leaving Special Forces. "Sometimes the hardest part of war is coming home." "Is coming home," the sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Shadow's trial starts next week, and his hardcore followers are looking at serious time. But the DA's agreed to alternative sentencing for anyone who completes the program, which is great news." As the sun set, the men prepared to leave, having accomplished so much in one day. Nobody could have imagined that by tomorrow, the damaged fields would be cleared, new seedlings planted, and the first counseling sessions completed. Hawk asked, wiping sweat from his face, to be there at dawn. James confirmed, and Hawk told the others that if they wanted help, the doors would be open that night. After everyone had gone, James sat on his porch with Eleanor, sharing coffee. "Rachel would be so proud," Eleanor said softly. "This was her dream too, wasn't it? Making the farm a place of healing." James nodded, looking out over the fields where former enemies had spent the day learning to create rather than destroy, she always said. Everyone deserves a second chance. Well, Eleanor stood there, gathering her empty basket. I'd say you're off to a good start, she said with a warm smile. Those boys remind me of you when you first came home. Lost, angry, needing purpose. They're good men. James nodded. I just need someone to remind them of that. As Eleanor drove away, James checked his phone. 5 more former Iron Ravens had texted, asking to join the program. Mike Anderson had sent a message about hiring 2 of them at his feed store. The seeds of change had been planted. Now they just needed time to grow. 2 weeks into the rehabilitation program. Oh dear, trouble arrived in the form of 30 motorcycles roaring into Millbrook Valley. The Death Riders, a rival gang from the neighboring state, had caught wind of the Iron Ravens' apparent weakness. James was teaching a group of veterans about irrigation systems when Hawk wrote, "We've got problems." Fast. James was calm as he spoke, though his eyes had already started scanning the horizon. The Death Riders were there, he told us. They're at Mike's feed store right now, threatening Tank and Ghost. Word got out about our change in management, so please, everyone, get back to the farm now at Mike Anderson's feed store. Tank and Ghost were facing off. Down came the Death Riders' leader, a mountain of a man known as Crusher. Both former Iron Ravens had been working legitimate jobs there for a week. Look at you two, Crusher said kindly, knocking over a display of feed bags and playing shop clerk. They were drawing honest paychecks. Iron Ravens turned into iron puppies, he warned. Leave. Crusher warned us. We're done with that life. Nobody's done until we say they're done. He knocked over a tool cart. Shadow might be in jail, but you still owe us protection payments from his deals. Mike Anderson wheeled himself out of his office. His healing leg was still in a brace. This is my property. Get out before I call the sheriff. Crusher laughed. Call whoever you want. I don't mind. Old man, by the time they get here, they're already here. James's quiet voice came from behind them. The Death Riders turned to find James standing there, accompanied by Sheriff Wilson and Deputy Chin. Trucks were pulling up behind them, and cars were pulling up, carrying more former Iron Ravens and townsfolk. This isn't your business, Farmer Crusher, you know. It is. James stepped forward. These men work for Mike. Mike's a friend, that makes it my business. Crusher looked around at his gang. 30 of us, 1 of you. I like those odds. Perhaps you might want to double-check your calculations, Sheriff Wilson, he commented with a smile as more vehicles arrived. Former Iron Ravens who had joined the rehabilitation program were pulling up along with dozens of townspeople. And even Eleanor was there, armed with her wooden spoon. This is what you left the Iron Ravens for, he teased, turning to Tank and Ghost, who were playing with some local heroes. Tank replied, standing tall and proud. We left because we found something better than fear. We found purpose and community. Ghost stepped forward to stand beside James. You're dead, all of you, he said, reaching inside his jacket. What happened? Before Crusher could draw his weapon, James moved with the liquid speed that had made him legendary in the Special Forces. The giant biker found himself disarmed and on the concrete floor. James said conversationally, maintaining his hold on Crusher, We're going to have a civilized discussion about territory and respect. The Death Riders reached for weapons but froze as Sheriff Wilson's deputies emerged from strategic positions, weapons ready. More importantly, they found themselves surrounded by determined townsfolk and reformed bikers standing shoulder to shoulder. To shoulder, see here's the thing, James continued, his voice carrying to everyone. Millbrook Valley isn't just some territory to be carved up. These people aren't marks for your protection racket. They're my friends, my family, our family. Hawk corrected, stepping forward, and the other former Iron Ravens nodded. So, James, you have 2 choices. He went on leave now and told everyone that Millbrook Valley is off limits. Or he applied slightly more pressure, making Crusher gasp. We can continue this discussion at the sheriff's station if you like. There was a tense moment, but then one of the Death Riders gunned his bike and took off, and the others followed quickly. They were gone within minutes. Crusher, thank goodness you're okay. Crusher wheezed. We're gone, Millbrook Valley's yours, no question. James corrected, helping him up but maintaining a firm grip. Remember, Millbrook Valley belongs to its people. That's something to keep in mind as the Death Riders retreated. Mike Anderson approached Tank and Ghost. Well, boys, that was quite an exciting lunch break. Now, about that inventory. You were busy cataloging the casual return to normality, which broke the tension. People began dispersing, though many headed to Eleanor's house. She'd announced an impromptu celebration dinner that evening, and the farm's barn was packed. Former enemies sat together, sharing Eleanor's delicious cooking, while Dr. Martinez led a group therapy session. Ghost's appearance had brought up some old memories for some of the veterans, which was totally understandable. During the session, Ghost admitted that he'd gone for a weapon because it was pure instinct, but that he'd chosen a different path, which is what matters. Sheriff Wilson was enjoying Eleanor's pie and pulled James aside to chat. He was spreading the word about James' program, which was really lovely to hear. I got calls from 3 other counties asking how to set up something similar. It's not my program, James replied. It belongs to everyone here, these men, this town. They're doing the real work, looking around the barn. James saw a tank teaching Tommy about engine maintenance while Eleanor supervised. Hawk was discussing plans for the veteran-run security company with Mike Anderson was doing a great job. Pastor Roberts was organizing a community garden project with Maria Gonzalez. Deputy Chin commented, joining them when you took down Shadow and the Iron Ravens. I thought that was impressive, but she gestured at the scene before them. This is the real victory. That night, after everyone had gone home, James sat on his porch steps, lost in thought. The confrontation with the Death Riders had proven something important. The changes in these men were real. When tested, they'd chosen their new community over their old ways. Hawk appeared out of the darkness, taking a seat beside him. What a day it's been, he said, smiling. It could have gone badly. James acknowledged, but it didn't because you showed us there's something worth fighting for besides ourselves. Hawk paused. The others wanted me to ask you something we've been talking about. A new name for our group. The next morning's gathering at Cooper Farm became a milestone. The former Iron Ravens had assembled in the barn, which now served as their unofficial headquarters. Valley Guardians, Hawk announced, that's what we want to call ourselves. James watched from the corner, seeing the pride in their faces as they discussed their new identity. The men had removed their old Iron Ravens patches, replacing them with simple black vests. No flashy logos or tank tops. James explained that there were no threatening symbols, just the words Valley Guardians and a wheat stalk because this valley gave them roots when they needed them most. Deputy Chin was present for the announcement and nodded approvingly. It's official, he said. Then I'll register it as a legitimate organization with the state. James nodded in agreement. The transformation went beyond just names, he said. Anderson had taken on 4 more veterans at his feed store, which was great to see. Maria Gonzalez was teaching 2 others about organic farming methods, which was fantastic. Even Frank Turner had taken on a few at his hardware store. He's such a great guy. James Sheriff Wilson arrived looking concerned, as he always does. Remember those 3 counties that asked about copying your program? Well, they're sending people today, lots of people. How many, I wonder? 5 sheriff's departments, a dozen social workers, the VA and AES in Wilson. He was a little hesitant about 30 gang members wanting to reform. I've heard rumors about what you did with the Death Riders. James rubbed his temples. We barely have enough space for our current program. That's not all, Wilson continued. The media caught wind of this story, and it spread like wildfire. National networks picked up on it, as if on cue. They heard vehicles approaching, looking out the barn door, and saw a convoy of cars and trucks heading toward the farm. News vans brought up the rear, and their satellite dishes were visible from a distance. Well, Eleanor appeared with her basket of muffins, and it was a good thing I baked extra. The next few hours were a bit of a whirlwind. Law enforcement officials from neighboring counties were keen to know about security protocols, social workers asked about counseling methods, VA reps discussed funding options, and the media wanted to film everything. But it was the arrival of the other gang members that proved most interesting. They came from different groups, some rivals, some allies of the former Iron Ravens. They'd all heard about Millbrook Valley's transformation and wanted the same chance. James nodded in agreement as he watched the new arrivals. It's like you said, he told Hawk. Warriors who lost their way just need someone to show them another path. James gathered everyone in the main field. The crowd had swollen to over 100 people, including officials, media, curious townsfolk, and former gang members. James addressed them with a warm smile. Let me be clear, he said. This isn't a quick fix or an easy way out of legal troubles. What we're doing here is hard work. It's about. He trailed off, looking around at the faces of those he loved. Rebuilding not just farms or businesses, but lives too. He gestured to the Valley Guardians. These men chose to change. They work every day to earn back trust. They face their traumas in therapy. They learn new skills. They help their community. If you're not ready for that commitment, there's the road nobody left right then, James. The first thing everyone with a camera needs to do is leave these men. They deserve privacy while they rebuild their lives. The media protested, but Sheriff Wilson and his deputies kindly escorted them to the property line. One reporter tried to argue about public interest, but James told him the public's interest is in successful rehabilitation, not reality TV. These men need space to heal. Once the cameras were gone, the real work began. Dr. Martinez and other counselors set up intake interviews. Pastor Roberts coordinated with churches from other counties about housing. Mike Anderson and Frank Turner talked about job training programs. The lovely Valley Guardians took charge of the new arrivals, showing them around and explaining the program. Their own experiences made them perfect mentors. See, that field tank told a group week ago that it was just dirt. Now it's growing beautiful roses. That's what this place does. It takes broken things and makes them grow. Margaret Helen Wilson and other town leaders organized a massive welcome dinner. It was so moving to see former gang members sitting down with law enforcement and townspeople to share a meal. I never thought I'd see something like this, Chun admitted, watching former rivals working together to set up tables as the sun set. James found a quiet moment with Hawk, made it all so clear. We're going to need more space and more resources. Hawk smiled. He'd already handled everything. The Valley Guardians voted and were donating all our seized assets, money, properties, everything to expand the program. That's a lot of money, James observed. It's significant. Hawk corrected him. It's time that served something good. Later that night, after most had left, the core group gathered in the barn. They had flip charts full of plans, housing developments, training programs, counseling schedules. It's growing beyond just us, Ghost said, looking at the plans. That's the point, James replied. Every person we help. Tommy, who'd been quiet all day, spoke up. You know what this means? The Valley Guardians could be everywhere, helping people in other towns like you helped us. The men exchanged looks. The idea of their redemption spreading, of helping others find their way back, was a powerful one. It was something they could do one step at a time. James cautioned. First, we need to make sure we do right by these new arrivals. Eleanor brought out one last pie. Well, better get started, she said. Hope you boys are ready for some long days ahead. As they shared the pie, plans were made, duties assigned. The Valley Guardians were no longer just a local group of. The bikers had turned over a new leaf. They were becoming something bigger, a model for change, a beacon of hope for others lost in darkness. 3 months after the program's expansion, Shadow's trial was drawing to a close. The courthouse was packed as James took the stand. His testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. Mr. Cooper, the prosecutor, began, Please tell the court about your interactions with the defendant and the Iron Ravens. Shadow glared from the defendant's table, but James remained calm. They came to my farm demanding protection money. When I refused, they threatened violence. You, a simple farmer, managed to subdue multiple armed attackers. James met Shadow's eyes. I'm tired, Special Forces Master Chief. There was nothing simple about it. The revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. Shadow's face went pale as 20 years of classified operations were briefly summarized for the court. After subduing them, the prosecutor continued. You offered rehabilitation instead of prosecution to those willing to change. Yes, because I recognized what they really were, lost warriors who needed a new mission. Shadow's lawyer tried challenging James's testimony, but footage from multiple phones showed exactly what happened that night when asked about the Death Riders incident. James simply stated that they should leave peacefully back at Cooper Farm. The expansion was in full swing, and the Valley Guardians had purchased adjacent properties using their surrendered assets. New dormitories housed 50 veterans in recovery training facilities and counseling centers, which operated daily. Problems at the Northfield Hulk were reported as James returned from court. New guys got into a fight, and old gang rivalries were dying hard. James found Tank and Ghost already handling the situation, separating two groups of former rivals. You want to fight? Tank demanded. Fine. Channel it right, he said, pointing to the boxing ring they'd set up in there. With gloves under supervision. That's the rule, and if you don't follow it, you're out of the program. The men looked a little sheepish, but they didn't say anything. Then one of them spoke up and told us that they killed his friend 2 years ago. How many of their friends did you kill? He asked. I didn't kill anyone, I just did my job, I told him. We've all got blood on our hands, he said quietly. I'm here to wash it off, I told him. The tension slowly started to break. The group separated and went off to different work assignments. Good job, James told Tank and Ghost. You're getting better at this. You're learning from the best, Ghost replied. I'm glad to hear it. I've just heard from the VA that they're officially recognizing our program. They're going to use it as a model nationwide. I'm so proud of you all. Inside the main barn, which has been converted into an admin and administrative center. Dr. Martinez was at the admin administrative center, where she was chatting with counselors from 3 counties. She was happy to report that the trauma-informed approach is working well. She said that combining therapy with physical work gives them a sense of purpose while they heal. Pastor Roberts arrived with some great news from his latest community outreach. For more churches want to sponsor rehabilitation programs, and the Business Association is offering more job placements. The Valley Guardians have become a really important part of the community. They provide security for local events, help elderly residents with home repairs, and maintain an emergency response team for natural disasters. When we used to terrorize places like this, Hawk mused during lunch, now we're protecting them. Deputy Chin brought updates from the sheriff's office, sharing some surprising statistics. The crime rate in Downs is 60% across 3 counties. Other gangs are either leaving or asking about rehabilitation. You're changing the whole region, but success brought new challenges that evening. James called an emergency meeting. Representatives from law enforcement, the VA, local government, and the Valley Guardians gathered in the barn. We've got a situation, James began. His words were spreading too fast. We're getting more requests than we can handle. And some people, it seems that you're trying to copy our program, but I'm not sure you fully understand it. Sheriff Wilson nodded and told us about 3 rehabilitation programs that are just scams. They're using our name to steal money from desperate families. Hawk added that other gangs are pretending to reform just to gather intelligence. He told us that he had to turn away 10 guys last week who were obviously plants. We really need to put some structure in place. Dr. Martinez suggested that we could have official certification training for program leaders and quality control. The discussion lasted hours. We made plans to formalize the program, create training protocols, and establish verification systems. The Valley Guardians would become trainers, teaching others. We're also helping other communities learn how to rehabilitate former gang members properly. It's not just about giving people second chances anymore, James explained. It's about doing it right. One failure could destroy everything we've built. Tommy, who's become the program's unofficial photographer, showed them his latest pictures. They show former enemies working together, veterans healing communities, and transforming. You know what? Eleanor asked, looking at the photo. I see hope. These men aren't just changing themselves. They're showing others it's possible. Late that night, after everyone left, James walked his fields. The once quiet farm had become a beacon of transformation, but with shadows. Sentencing was approaching, and copycats were threatening their work. Bigger challenges lay ahead. Hawk joined him on his walk. Shadow's lawyer approached me. He wanted me to testify that James had used excessive force. He offered a deal and told me to shove it. We've got a new code now. Hawk looked over the illuminated buildings. Former gang members were finding new lives there. Everything we built here is bigger than Shadow. It's bigger than any of us. James nodded. He understood that the small seed of change they'd planted had grown into something remarkable. Now they had to protect it, nurture it, and help it spread properly. James said quietly, Rachel would have loved this. He continued, she always said the farm could heal people. I never knew how right she was. Shadow Davidson's sentencing hearing changed everything. The courtroom fell silent as he stood for his final statement. Instead of showing remorse, his eyes blazed with hatred. It's over, Shadow said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face James, his eyes blazing with fury. The death threats were just the beginning. I've got friends in darker places, and they're coming for your little fairy tale farm. The judge sentenced him to 15 years, but the damage was done. His words had sparked a chain of events that would test everything the Valley Guardians had built. 2 days later, James found Hawk waiting in his office. Before dawn, we received confirmation that Shadow wasn't bluffing. The Demon Kings are mobilizing, James's expression hardened. The Demon Kings were no ordinary gang. They were an organized crime syndicate with connections across multiple states. How many? At least 100 writers. But that's not the worst part. Hawk handed over a file. They're targeting our other rehabilitation centers too. All at once, the Valley Guardians had successfully established 5 satellite programs in neighboring counties. Each center housed dozens of veterans trying to rebuild their lives. Sheriff Wilson called an emergency meeting with law enforcement representatives from 6 counties. They crowded into the barn alongside Valley Guardian leaders. We've got to protect what we've built. These men have put their trust in us, and we're not going to let them down. Dr. Martinez spoke up. We have 87 veterans in active rehabilitation across all centers. Many are still dealing with PTSD, and a violent confrontation could undo months of therapy. Not to mention the community support we'd lose if this turns into a war. Deputy Chan added, James, you've got that map we've been looking at? You're a specialist in this field, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. We really need to evacuate the satellite centers and bring everyone here. That's over 200 people, including the staff and their families. Pastor Roberts asked, Where will we put them? Eleanor suggested. From the doorway, everyone turned. No one had heard her arrive. It's empty this season, with plenty of cabins and a good security setup. My construction crews can fortify it. Frank Turner offered. Got lumber and materials ready to go. The Valley Guardians moved with him. It was incredible to see such military precision in action. In just a few hours, convoys of trucks were discreetly relocating members of the rehabilitation program. Local businesses were quick to provide supplies, and community members were happy to open their homes. James was in charge of coordinating everything from the farm, which had become their command center. He was amazed to see former enemies working together, helping families evacuate, securing properties, and establishing communication networks. It was so inspiring to see breakers and outlaws working together for a common cause. James commented, referring to two formerly rival gangs whose members had gone through rehabilitation. They're not breakers or outlaws anymore, he said with a smile. Hawk replied, They're Valley Guardians now by nightfall. The leadership team made us look like the aggressors and turned the community against us. Deputy CH reported that she'd been checking her phone, and social media was lighting up with rumors that we were a rival gang and that we were the ones causing trouble. Well, it was time to show them who we really are. James decided the next morning that the Valley Guardians would launch Operation Community Shield. Teams of reformed veterans wearing their new uniforms began providing free security for local businesses and helping elderly residents with home repairs. Others helped with free checkups in underserved areas. Local media covered their efforts, and there were lots of testimonials from families whose lives had been changed by the rehabilitation program. Churches and civic groups publicly endorsed their work, and there was even free security for local businesses. Others helped elderly residents with home repairs. Medical teams offered free checkups in underserved areas. Local media covered their efforts. Testimonials poured in from families whose lives had been changed by the rehabilitation program. Churches and civic groups publicly endorsed their work. See what you did, Ellen? Telling James. Watching the news coverage, you didn't just teach them to fight differently. They taught them to live differently, but the Demon Kings weren't finished that evening. 3 suspicious fires broke out across town as first responders rushed to handle them. Dark figures were spotted near the school. The Valley Guardians were ready. Teams of reformed veterans coordinating with the police intercepted the WB bombers before they could plant explosive devices. The attackers were caught on camera, proving the Demon Kings were targeting innocent people. Civilians, they're trying to scare the community. Sheriff Wilson said during their nightly briefing, If they make people too afraid to support us, then we'll show them what real strength looks like. James replied that night as thunder rolled across the valley. James stood watch at the farm. The calm before the storm felt familiar. He'd experienced it many times during his Special Forces missions. Hawk joined him on patrol. When I was with the Iron Ravens, I used to think strength meant making people fear you. Now I understand it's about making them trust you. Lightning illuminated the valley, and with it hundreds of headlights approaching from multiple directions. The Demon Kings had arrived. The storm was about to break, and with it would come their greatest test yet. Not just of their ability to defend what they'd built, but of their commitment to transformation itself. The question wasn't whether they could win a fight. It was whether they could win without becoming what they once were. It wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about winning without becoming what they once were. The hundreds of approaching headlights cast an eerie glow across Millbrook Valley. James watched from his tactical position as the Demon Kings surrounded the area. Their numbers were even greater than intelligence suggested. At least 200 bikes. All units, check in. James spoke quietly into his radio. Church camp secure. Tank reported all rehabilitation. Thankfully, all the members are safe and the town perimeter is covered. The Ghost has confirmed that the police and Valley Guardians are in position. The community center is locked down. Deputy Chen has added emergency services, who are standing by the Demon King's leader, a man known only as the Judge. The judge arrived at the farm's main entrance. He carried himself with cold calculation, unlike Shadow's brash aggression. His leather cut bore no patches except a simple scale of justice twisted and broken. The judge's voice boomed across the property. "Come face your judgment." James stepped into the light alone, his casual stance betraying none of the combat readiness beneath. "It was a bit dramatic, don't you think? You've undermined everything we stand for." The judge snarled, turning warriors into farmers and making predators into prey. James replied calmly, "I helped lost men find their way home. That's a big difference." The judge signaled, and his riders revved their engines. "Engines, we're sorry to say that we're going to have to shut down your programs. We kindly ask that you send our people back, or we'll have to burn everything your people have worked for." James raised an eyebrow. "They're not just property, they're men who chose a better path than you did, James. War. I choose this." The Demon King was suddenly surrounded by the community itself. Hundreds of townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder. To shoulder with the Valley Guardians, farmers on tractors, they blocked the escape routes. Church buses created barriers, construction workers manned impromptu barricades. "You were gathering your army," James continued, "and we were reminding these men what real brotherhood looks like from within the Demon King's ranks." Dozens of riders suddenly pulled away, removing their gang colors. The judge's eyes widened as he realized the truth. They'd infiltrated his own organization with rehabilitated members. "It was a surprise. Your own people chose us. Hawk emerged from the shadows because we offer something you never could, redemption." The judge reached for a weapon, but James was too quick for him, disarming him effortlessly. "Oh, this isn't happening here." More and more Demon Kings began removing their colors. They'd seen the success stories and heard about second chances. Some of them had family members in the rehabilitation program. The fearsome army was dissolving right before their eyes. "This is what strength really looks like." James addressed the remaining riders. He told them not to be afraid or violent. He told them to choose community. "And pie." Eleanor's voice carried from the porch where she stood with her ever-present basket. "Change always goes better with pie." The tension broke, and several Demon Kings actually laughed. They'd heard about Eleanor's legendary pies through the rehabilitation grapevine. "You have a choice," James continued, "stay in the fight against an entire community ready to defend its own, or..." He gestured to the Valley Guardians, inviting them to join him in finding a better way. The judge's power visibly crumbled as he made one last desperate move. "Anyone who turns coat is dead," he warned. "We will hunt you down like you hunted me." A new voice spoke from behind the townspeople. Shadow's former Lieutenant Drake emerged. "I've been undercover in your organization for weeks," he said. "I've got enough evidence to take you down. Your entire operation." Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, holding up a flash drive including your connections to 3 state crime syndicates. "The FBI is very interested." The judge's face went ashen. More riders began removing their colors. James said quietly, "I'm sorry, but your way is finished. The only question is whether you're smart enough to change with the times." What happened next? The events of that day would be talked about for years in Millbrook Valley. As dawn broke, nearly 150 former Demon King members stood in line at the farm, turning in their colors and signing up for rehabilitation. The judge and his few loyal followers were arrested without further incident. Their criminal empire was collapsing as evidence was revealed. Tommy recorded everything on his phone. His phone captured the moment perfectly. It was so lovely to see former enemies sharing Eleanor's pie. Townspeople helping newcomers fill out registration forms. Valley Guardians welcoming their former rivals as brothers. It's so wonderful to see how things have changed. Watching the scene a year ago, we were terrorizing towns like this, not defending. James corrected, transforming them and ourselves in the process. Dr. Martinez organized initial counseling assessments. It's so inspiring to see how far we've come. We're going to need a bigger farm, though. The morning sun rose over a changed valley. The night that was meant to destroy their work had instead validated it in the most powerful way possible. The Valley Guardians weren't just a rehabilitation program anymore. They were a movement. News spread of what happened in Millbrook Valley, and requests for help poured in from across the country. Law enforcement agencies, veterans groups and communities struggling with gang violence all wanted to learn from their success. "We're going to need help, James," they said. James told the leadership team that they couldn't do this alone anymore. He was wrong, though. They had always been alone. Eleanor reminded him that's the whole point. The Valley Guardians began developing training programs and sending teams to help other communities set up their own rehabilitation centers. But they never forgot their roots. They never forgot the simple farm where it all started. They never forgot the belief that even the hardest hearts could change. You know what Rachel would say about all this, James? He asked Eleanor late that night. She smiled, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. She'd say, "You're just getting started." And she was right. The transformation of Millbrook Valley was just the beginning. A new chapter was about to unfold. It would reach far beyond their quiet corner of the world. 5 years after the first confrontation at Cooper Farm, James stood in a field of blooming roses, watching the sunrise with his morning coffee. The farm had grown into a sprawling campus of hope. But this original field remained special. "It was where everything I thought I'd find you here," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the morning dew. She wasn't carrying a basket of pie for once, but rather 2 letters. "This one's from the White House," she said, smiling. The Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony was scheduled for next month. But that wasn't what brought the smile to James's face. It was the other letter Eleanor carried from a small town in Montana. Their first graduate class, Eleanor explained. 40 former gang members, all veterans, and James, she said, smiling. And she was growing Rachel's roses, too. The heritage rose seeds that Eleanor had saved after that first violent night had become a symbol of transformation. Every new rehabilitation center started with these plants, a living reminder that growth comes from nurturing, not force. The morning calm was broken by the rumble of motorcycles, but these riders wore different colors now. The Valley Guardians emblem of a rising sun over crossed rose stems had become a symbol of hope across the country. Tank led the convoy. On his return from an emergency response mission in tornado-hit Texas, Tank reported that his face was tired but proud. He was working alongside former Death Riders, helping to rebuild homes. Even the locals were amazed. The Valley Guardians had become the largest veteran disaster response organization in the country. Their reputation for turning former enemies into allies had made them the perfect choice for bringing communities together in crisis. At the training center, they were training to become the best they could be. Shadow was released early for good behavior, and now he was teaching a class on conflict resolution. He told his students that strength isn't about who can hurt who. It's about who can help heal. Ghost's medical program had expanded to include mental health services. "We don't just patch wounds anymore." He explained to a new group of combat medics that they heal the invisible ones too. Hawk now advises the Department of Justice on rehabilitation programs. He brought the latest numbers over 10,000. "We've had 000 graduates across the country and 83 rehabilitation centers, with a whopping 94% success rate." But the real success stories were in the details, like Tommy, who'd grown from a scared kid hiding from bikers to running the Valley Guardians Youth Outreach Program. Or the former Demon King scout, who tried to infiltrate them years ago and now coordinates their anti. I'm happy to share some surprising news. As you may remember, we used to track gang territories. Well, now we track transformation zones, which are areas where Valley Guardian graduates are actively rebuilding communities. The old Iron Ravens warehouse, which once represented fear, has become the Valley Guardians National Training Headquarters. The walls that once planned violence now display success stories of thousands of people. As the sun set, the farm hosted its annual community dinner. Tables stretched across the fields where battles once raged. Former enemies broke bread together, sharing stories of transformation. It was a beautiful sight to see. Dr. Martinez watched the gathering with a smile. Pastor Roberts nodded in agreement. "When we started, we thought we were just stopping. But we were wrong. Violence turns out we were rebuilding souls." "Eleanor, you were amazing with the pies. You know, we can't celebrate properly without dessert." James stood to address the gathering, which was very rare for him. 5 years ago on this very field, we had a choice: meet violence with violence or try something different. We chose to believe in the power of second chances. He gestured to the transformed. The campus around them was transformed, but what we really built wasn't just buildings or programs. We built proof that it's never too late to change. We built proof that even the hardest hearts can soften when given the right soil to grow in. Shadow stood up next, surprising everyone. "I was so surprised. I thought I was building an empire, but I was actually building a prison. These people showed me how to build something better, a community." As the sun set over Cooper Farm, James walked the grounds one last time. Every step held memories. The spot where he first confronted the Iron Ravens. The barn where enemies became allies. The fields where lost souls found their way home. Hawk joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know what I realized? We're not really grieving roses here. We're growing hope." James smiled, remembering Rachel's words from so long ago. Sometimes the smallest seeds yield the biggest harvests. The Valley Guardians had become more than just a group of people. They were a community. He took one last stroll through the grounds, every step filled with memories. The spot where he'd first confronted the Iron Ravens, the barn where enemies became allies, the fields where lost souls found their way home. Hawk joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He suddenly realized that they weren't just growing roses, but also hope. James smiled, remembering Rachel's words from so long ago. Sometimes the smallest seeds yield the biggest harvests. The Valley Guardians had become so much more than that. This amazing organization is living proof that transformation is possible. It shows us that enemies can become family, and that warriors can find new battles worth fighting. It all started because one former Special Forces soldier believed in second chances. A grandmother wielded a wooden spoon with love, and a community chose to build bridges instead of walls. The story of Cooper Farm isn't just about stopping violence or rehabilitating veterans. It's about remembering. As night fell over the valley, the lights of the campus glowed like stars fallen to earth. Each light represented a life transformed, a heart healed, a warrior who'd found their way home. The seeds of change had grown into a forest of hope, spreading far beyond Millbrook Valley. Somewhere, James knew Rachel was smiling. "You know," Eleanor said, joining him for one last cup of coffee. Coffee on the porch. Rachel always said that every garden needs 3 things to grow: good soil, patient tending, and most importantly, someone who believes in what they're planting. James looked out over the transformed valley, where former enemies now worked together to help others find their way home. She was right. Well, then Eleanor stood, gathering her empty basket. "I'd say we've got ourselves quite a garden here indeed," she said with a smile. And they did. It was still growing.